This is Value Investing. I'm your host, Jun Kim. In this podcast, you'll learn everything related to value investing. Hello, fellow investors. Welcome to another episode of the Value Investing Podcast. Over the last two episodes, we talked about cognitive errors stemming from belief perseverance and information processing errors. On today's show, I want to talk about another important biases, which are coming from emotional errors. So it's going to be very interesting topic, so stick around. And before I get started, let me just give you a quick disclaimer, as always, that this podcast is for entertainment purposes only, and it is your responsibility to consult with your investment professional for any investment decisions. So without further delay, why don't we get started? So as I mentioned, in the last two episodes, we talked about cognitive errors. The first episode, we talked about conservatism bias, confirmation bias, illusion of control, representativeness bias, and hindsight bias. And in the last episode, we talked about anchoring bias, mental accounting, framing bias, and availability bias. So if you haven't got a chance to listen to these two episodes, I highly recommend you go back and listen to these two episodes first and then come here. But this episode is going to be independent of these two other episodes. So if you just like to stick around and just listen to this episode, it's also fine. So as I mentioned, I want to talk about emotional biases. And these are the biases that are really hard to correct, even if you know the existence of these biases. So in that sense, it's different from cognitive errors because, as I mentioned in the last two episodes, cognitive errors are relatively easy to be corrected once you know the existence of those biases. But emotional biases are something that it's very hard to correct, even if you know. So let's go over them and see why it is the case. So what I like to talk about is 6 different emotional biases today. Loss aversion bias, overconfidence bias, self-control bias, endowment bias, regret aversion bias, status quo bias. So these are the 6 emotional biases that I like to talk about on today's show. Since we have a lot of materials to cover, why don't we just dive into the materials? The first one that I like to talk about is loss aversion bias. So what is it? Loss aversion refers to people's tendency to prefer avoiding losses to acquiring equivalent gains. Loss aversion implies that one who loses $100 will lose more satisfaction than another person will gain satisfaction from $100 windfall. So you probably have this tendency. I definitely have this tendency as well. So whenever you are investing in the stock market, even if you have some losing positions, you probably hold on to that position in the hopes of breaking even at some point in the future. But the problem is that if you tend to hold on to losing positions, there is a great probability that that position would lose more money in the future. And what's more at risk is that you are incurring opportunity costs as a result of holding on to that position because you have your capital strapped to that position and you cannot utilize that capital more efficient manner. I also want to say that loss aversion is not always the bad thing for investing. So let me just see how you can use loss aversion in some cases to your advantage. First, if you have huge loss aversion, you can invest in securities only when the odds are stacked hugely in your favor. In other words, when you have very large margin of safety. So your main goal is not to lose money. And in order to do that, you only invest your money in the securities whenever you have large margin of safety. So that's actually upside of having this loss aversion and use that to your advantage. And also you can pass up a lot of investment opportunities if you feel that they're not falling into your circle of confidence and you can actually be successful even after having huge loss aversion effect. And lastly, I think I also want to mention that you can try to avoid any leverage, because once you leverage your portfolio, your gain is going to be huge if things actually go in the right direction. But if things go in the wrong direction, then your loss is going to be also huge. So it's always symmetrical. So you have to watch out for any potential catastrophic losses. Again, here, if you have large loss aversion, then this is something that you can use to your advantage by avoiding any leverage that is not necessary, and also try to always have large margin of safety whenever you buy into certain positions. So that's just my piece of advice. So that was loss aversion. Let's move on to the next bias. The next bias is overconfidence bias. So people tend to be overconfident in their judgment. And a study shows that 8 out of 10 people think that they are above average drivers, which is obviously not true. It doesn't make sense. But people have tendency to think that their skill sets are better than others. And also, let me just give you another example. A person who thinks he's invaluable to his or her employer when almost anyone could actually do his or her job. If that's the case, then that person might show his or her overconfidence by coming in late to work, because this person thinks that he can not get fired, and also can be overly demanding about getting a raise and so on. And nobody likes that kind of person. So this person is going to be at risk of being laid off at some point in the future if he or she persists acting this way. So that's part of overconfidence bias. And when it comes to investing, people tend to think that they can beat the market. I think, including me, whenever you actually manage your money by yourself, that means you think that you can beat the market. If you really think that you can beat the market, you want to make an assessment about yourself. What are your strengths? What sets you apart from other people? And what makes you think that you can beat the market? What makes you so special? Those are the type of questions that you have to ask to yourself in order to make objective assessment about whether or not you can beat the market. Also, some people believe that they develop a special formula they can use to beat the market, and they really stick with that. And as probably you know, I don't think that formula approach is going to work out well over a long period of time, because let's say you develop very special formula that could actually bring you very high rate of return. Then that formula is going to be discovered by other people, and it's not going to be useful anymore after a certain time period. So that's why formula-based approach is not probably a good idea as far as investing is concerned. But if you have that belief, and if you are overconfident about your ability to use this formula, then you're falling into trap of overconfidence bias. Let's look at another example when it comes to investing. So people overlook the risks associated with specific stocks and assign the probability of losing money in that stock incorrectly. So what can we do in order to avoid overconfidence? The first thing that you have to do is be humble. Admit that we can all be wrong anytime, and seek out opposing views and be open to listening to other people. Because if you buy into one stock, then you probably have strong conviction that you're going to make money here. But just take a look at, short side of the story and opposing views, and try to understand if they have any merit of proposing those ideas. And another thing that I also want to mention is that don't concentrate too much in one specific stock. You always have to strike a balance between the number of stocks that you hold and the return that you're going to get. And if you believe that you have very high level of confidence in one stock, then you can actually increase the stake in that specific stock. But you may want to have some system where you don't invest, maybe more than 20% of your total portfolio. Diversification actually is very subjective concept. Some people think that 20% of investment is well diversified. Other people think that this is so concentrated. So it all depends on your situation. But a rule of thumb is that you probably need 6 stocks at the minimum that are in completely different industries. So if you own 6 financial institutions, that doesn't mean that you are doing the diversification because they are all in the same industry. So you want to have at least 6 different stocks in completely different industry, and that probably will provide some diversification effect. But if you want to invest in individual stocks and own, let's say, 100 stocks, then you kind of lose sight of like what they are and what these companies are doing. So there's always a balance between the number of stocks that you own, concentration versus diversification. Because if you diversify your portfolio too much, then you probably get rid of all these idiosyncratic risks, but you're probably going to get just market return, which means you're better off just buying index fund. So think about the balance. Always everything is balanced in life. So that's what I wanted to say here. So that's about overconfidence, and everyone is exposed to this bias, including me. So let's just watch out for not getting into this trap. The next bias that I like to talk about today is self-control bias. So this is human behavioral tendency that causes people to fail to act in pursuit of their long-term overarching goals because of a lack of self-discipline. Many people are notorious for displaying a lack of self-control when it comes to money. So let me just give you some examples. Self-control bias can cause investors to spend more today at the expense of saving for tomorrow. It may cause investors to fail to plan for retirement. So this is a good example of self-control bias, and this is not easy to control, right? So this is very similar to losing weight. So people know exactly what they need to do to lose weight. There's only 2 things you need to do: eat less, exercise more. It's very simple, but it's not easy to execute. It's basically the same. So this is like self-control bias. So people have their money right now in their pocket and they want to spend their money right now. They know that if they invest this money in the stock market, or if they put this money in high yield savings account, then they can have more money in the future. But that's not what people really think and how they react. They have tendency to spend more money today at the expense of saving money for tomorrow. So that's self-control bias. As far as investing is concerned, I think a lot of investors check stock price too often. That's just my view. And they know that it's not going to really yield anything for them, and it's not going to result in any gains for them, but they can't help but checking stock price every day, even if they perceive themselves to be a long-term investor. And also, it's probably going to prevent you from becoming a long-term investor, because as you check stock prices too often, you're going to get more influenced by Mr. Market, and that's really not good for your mental health and physical health either. I don't know how to overcome this self-control bias, because as I mentioned, this is similar to losing weight. And there are just a lot of people who want to lose weight, but they can't because they're lacking self-discipline. Or, there might be some other issues that I'm not aware of. And it's just not easy because it requires a huge self-discipline for yourself. And it's basically the same for investing. So regarding investing, you need to have, the right temperament. That's what Warren Buffett has mentioned in the past. And right temperament means that you need to be patient and you need to control yourself. You shouldn't be stupid when it comes to selling your stocks and buying stocks. What I mean by that is, don't sell your stocks when stock crashes, and don't buy stocks when everyone is jumping onto the bandwagon. And those are the things that you have to always keep in mind, because it's easy to fall into these traps. But anyway, so that's about self-control bias, I like to give some advice related to this field, but as I mentioned, this is very simple but not easy to execute, so I'll leave it up to you. The next bias is endowment bias. Endowment bias describes a circumstance in which an individual values something they already own more than something they don't own yet. Investors, therefore, tend to stick with certain assets because of familiarity and comfort, even if they are inappropriate or become unprofitable. Okay, so that's the definition of endowment bias. So simply, it's basically saying that you value what you have a lot more than what you don't have. So let me just give you an example. So there are two experiments that I like to talk about. The first experiment is called the mug experiment. So this study shows the endowment effect, and scientists randomly divided participants into buyers and sellers and gave the sellers coffee mugs as a gift. They then asked the sellers for how much they would sell the mug and asked the buyers for how much they would buy. The results show that the sellers who already owned the mugs placed a significantly higher value on the mugs than the buyers did. They were willing to sell a mug for $7 approximately, while buyers were willing to pay approximately $3. So there's a huge difference between how sellers price the mug versus buyers, because sellers already have these mugs in their hands, so they value a lot more. This is endowment effect. Another experiment is called the basketball tickets experiment. And here, Duke University conducts a lottery between fans that want tickets because there's not enough space for everyone. After one of the lotteries occurred, the researchers called and asked the winners who got the tickets how much they would sell the tickets for. Then they called and asked the losers how much they would buy it for. The results revealed that the selling price point was almost 14 times more than the buying one. The lottery winners wanted $2,400 on average to give up their tickets, while the lottery losers who did not have the tickets were willing to buy them for only $175. So this is quite interesting. The moment the lottery winners got their tickets, they valued them to a higher degree, and giving them up become much harder. Right? That's kind of the opposite for lottery losers. So this is not rational from any perspective. What about investing? So when it comes to investing, you could value the stocks you already own a lot more than other stocks available out there. So this is problematic if you have high opportunity cost, which is not investing in those other stocks. So you have to have, objective views about what you already have in your portfolio versus what you don't have in other portfolios. You have to make assessment in terms of how much level of confidence you have stocks within your portfolio versus others. Make assessments in terms of circle of confidence, all these concepts. But all things equal, you probably want to get rid of endowment effect by having objective views. The other thing that you're probably going to go through is that once you buy a house, you live there for, more than 5 years, and you attach to the house and you have strong bonding with your house, and you want to maybe sell your house at some point in the future. What's going to happen is that endowment effect is going to take effect, and you may put your house up for sale at a price a lot higher than the market value. Because you think that it is really valuable because it's your own house, it's your own baby, but the market participants or buyers, potential buyers, would not think that way. They have a lot of options. So if this house is not sold for a certain time period, then you probably end up, selling it at a low price because people think that there's something wrong with the house, and if it's not sold within a certain time period. And if the house is, listed for more than 30 days, then people would lose interest of even looking at your house. So you probably will lose a lot more money if you don't actually price your house in an objective manner. So anyway, those are the examples that I can think of related to endowment bias. So let's move on to the next bias. Next bias is called regret aversion. Regret theory states that people anticipate regret if they make a wrong choice, and they take this anticipation into consideration when making decisions. Fear of regret can play a significant role in dissuading someone from taking an action or motivating a person to take an action. So as far as investing is concerned, regret theory, regret bias, can either make investors risk averse or it can motivate them to take greater risks. So let me just, provide some examples for your understanding. Suppose that an investor buys a stock in a small growth company based only on a friend's personal recommendation. After 6 months, the stock falls to 50% of the purchase price. So the investor sells the stock and realizes a loss. To avoid this regret in the future, the investor will ask questions and research any stocks that his friend recommends. Conversely, suppose the investor didn't take the friend's recommendation to buy the stock and the price increased by 50%. To avoid the regret of missing out, the investor will be less risk averse this time and will likely buy any stocks that his friend recommends in the future without conducting any background research of his own. So this is regret aversion example. And I think that this happens all the time, and we know our emotions. And even if we know, then sometimes we can't help but fall into this kind of trap. So another regret aversion case is that people really think that this is actually combined with loss aversion, and people don't want to lose money. As a result of that, they avoid investing in stock market altogether. And I think that's a huge opportunity cost, because over the long term, the stock market has produced 6 to 8% return. And if you look at other asset classes, then you cannot find other asset classes like that other than real estate. So if you just invest based on your feelings, then it's a huge mistake. But if you can allocate your capital and spread them out over a long period and keep investing regardless of market fluctuations consistently over time, I think you're going to do fine by investing your money in index fund like S&P 500, a low-cost index fund. But because of risk aversion, a lot of people avoid the stock market and buying a house altogether, and I think that's a mistake. Anyway, so let's move on to the last bias for today's show, which is status quo bias. Status quo bias is something that involves people preferring that things stay as they are or that the current state of affairs remains the same. Change can be a scary thing for a lot of people. I know this is the case. And even though it's probably going to cost them a lot, people try to stay where they are and try not to change. So let me just give you quick examples of this status quo bias. A lot of people tend to stay in the current position even if other good opportunities arise, and also they tend to live in the same place and they try not to move to different places. And if you look at food, you probably tend to go to the same restaurants as before and try not to experiment new food and so on. So these are the status quo bias and also related to staying within your comfort zone. And if you want to get out of comfort zone, then it requires some more energy and it gives you some stress. And that's why people tend to stay where they are. But as you know, if you stay where you are for more than a certain period of time, when it comes to, let's say, your job, then you're not learning. You need to have some steep learning curve in order to improve yourself in your current job position. And if you just do exactly what you have done in the past, then you're probably going to be an expert in that area, but you're not going to learn anything new and you're going to probably fall behind compared to other people. So if you want to get ahead of other people and you want to make yourself productive and you want to be more competitive, then you have to force yourself out of your comfort zone and, go and do something else. When it comes to jobs and meeting new people, trying new food, and go to different places. And especially if you're young, then you have to do all these things before you are established in one place. Anyway, so let's go to investing area and see what we have to do. So when it comes to investing, people tend to stay with their current portfolio. And actually, this is not necessarily bad. Even though this is status quo bias, you probably want to be a long-term investor and you can hold on to your current positions to become a long-term investor if you believe that fundamentals are still intact. And only my strategy is only trade my stocks when fundamentals are actually different from my initial assessment and deteriorates over time, or if the market itself is very, very overvalued. So there is always opportunity cost associated with sticking with your current portfolio. So it's always striking a balance between becoming a long-term investor and switching to different stocks. And that's always something that you have to think about and always have to take into consideration when it comes to investing your money. So there's no one solution that you always have to stick with, but always think about all these things and put it into consideration. And that's something that we all always have to worry about. Anyway, so those are the things that I wanted to go through on today's show. So let me just quickly go over what we have discussed today. We talked about emotional biases, 6 emotional biases: loss aversion bias, overconfidence bias, self-control bias, endowment bias, regret aversion bias, status quo bias. So these are 6 emotional biases that we discussed. And as I mentioned many times, emotional biases are not something that you can easily correct. So it's better to be aware of existence of these biases, but also think about what is the best way for you to overcome these biases. And I can provide some advice, but it's all up to you because each individual is different when it comes to handling their emotions. And some people can quit smoking or drinking quite easily, whereas other people cannot. So because they have different discipline and they have different temperament, so there's no one specific solution that can fit into everyone's problems. So that's why I think it's important for you to be aware of these biases and try to explore different solutions that actually are suitable for your case. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this podcast and learned something out of this episode. And that's it. So if you haven't already done so, please leave your rating or comments on whichever platform you listen to this podcast. This podcast is basically broadcast on many different platforms, including iTunes, Android phone apps, and so on. So I'll try to read them. And if you also want to listen this podcast from my homepage, I'm going to leave the link there in the show notes so that you can just go there and check it out. Thank you very much and see you next time.